Happy Friday there, kiddos. Welcome to episode 21 of Stir Crazy, where we talk real shit about the news. Of course, brought to you by the Real News Network. I am your host, Kim Brown. Coming up on today's program, no, seriously, folks, Trump is taking strict and explicit aim at immigrants, making via executive order banning the issuance of green cards, not only for green card holders, but for their families as well. This is affecting people in real time. We're going to get into that in just a bit. And also, our food supply is very vulnerable at this point in time because from the farmers to the grocery store workers and all points in between, should any one of those elements fail, we are seriously screwed. We've got the details about that. And of course, the big story, I know that you have heard about this 1,000 ways since early this morning or from yesterday. Trump is advising people who are infected with coronavirus to possibly consume disinfectant, much to the horror of the good folks over there at Lysol. We're going to get into that first, but now it's time to bring in our fine Friday panel. I'd like to introduce everybody. We are joined today with Don Rojas. Don is the executive political editor here at the Real News Network. Also joined today with Marc Steiner. He's a veteran broadcaster and the managing editor here at the Real News. And Sahar Aziz is the director for the Center for Security, Race, and Rights. Panel, thank you guys so much for being here on this Good Friday.
Pleasure.
Yeah. Well, of course, gang, we got to start off with it's the goofy news, but it's real news for the simple fact that it came from the White House podium out of the mouth of the President of the United States. We'll let him do all the talking.
So supposing we hit the body with a tremendous, whether it's ultraviolet or just very powerful light. And I think you said that hasn't been checked, but you're going to test it. And then I said, supposing you brought the light inside the body, which you can do either through the skin or in some other way. And I think you said you're going to test that too. Sounds interesting. Right, and then I see the disinfectant where it knocks it out in a minute, 1 minute. And is there a way we can do something like that by injection inside or almost a cleaning? Because you see it gets on the lungs and it does a tremendous number of the lungs. So it'd be interesting to check that. So that you're going to have to use medical doctors with. But it sounds interesting to me. So a lot of people have been talking about summer. Maybe this is one of the reasons. I once mentioned that maybe it does go away with heat and light. And people didn't like that statement very much. The fake news didn't like it at all. And I just threw it out as a suggestion, but it seems like that's the case.
It would be irresponsible for us to say that we feel that the summer is just going to totally kill the virus and that if it's a free-for-all and that people ignore those guides. That is not the case.
The president mentioned the idea of cleaners with bleach and isopropyl alcohol you mentioned. There's no scenario that could be injected into a person, is there?
No, I'm here to talk about the findings that we had in the study. We don't do that within that lab, our labs. So.
I would like you to speak to the medical doctors to see if there's any way that you can apply light and heat to cure. You know, that if you could, and maybe you can, maybe you can't. Again, I say maybe you can, maybe you can't. I'm not a doctor, but I'm like a person that has a good, you know what.
But sir, you're the president.
Deborah, have you ever heard of that? The heat and the light relative to certain viruses, yes, but relative to this virus?
Not as a treatment. I mean, certainly fever is a good thing when you have a fever. It helps your body respond. But not as, I've not seen heat or light.
I think it's a great thing to look at. I mean, you know, okay.
Respectfully, sir, you're the president, and people tuning into these briefings, they want to get information and guidance and want to know what to do. They're not looking for rumors.
I'm the president, and you're fake news. And you know what I'll say to you? I'll say very nicely, I know you well. I know you well, because I know the guy. I see what he writes. He's a total faker. So are you ready? Are you ready? Are you ready? It's just a suggestion from a brilliant lab by a very, very smart, perhaps brilliant man. He's talking about sun, he's talking about heat, and you see the numbers. So that's it. That's all I have. I'm just here to present talent. I'm here to present ideas because we want ideas to get rid of this thing. And if heat is good and if sunlight is good, that's a great thing as far as I'm concerned.
You know, I wish people would stop mentioning Trump on Twitter with their harebrained, concoctions for a cure for the coronavirus. I mean, gang. I mean, beyond being grossly irresponsible,
Oh my God.
this is just inane shittery coming out of the mouth of the president of the United States. Don, I want to start with you. Can we get your reaction to this?
Well, this is buffoonery at its height. This is a president who is an ignoramus. He doesn't know what he's talking about. But of course, this is his show, and he uses the briefings every day as a way of communicating with his rabid base. Unfortunately, I don't know if you saw the look on the face of Dr. Bush when he was talking about the bleach and the light and so on. She had this pained expression on her face. And when he then turned to her to ask her for her opinion, she mumbled something that was incoherent. But, as Bernie Sanders said, this is the most dangerous president in the modern history of the United States. And the reason that he's so dangerous is that he thinks that he knows what he's talking about, and he doesn't. He is an existential threat to all of us, unfortunately, because of his ignorance. And what we have here is a man who has risen to power, not voted into power by the majority of the American electorate, but by the quirks of the Electoral College, and he continues to use or misuse his bully pulpit as a not as a platform to really inform or inspire the American people, but basically to reaffirm his psychosis. The man is a megalomaniac, and we have to understand that in the context of how dangerous he is.
Don, when you mentioned Dr. Birx in that press room, she absolutely looked like she wanted to sink into the floor. And Marc Steiner, Donald Trump stands at the podium and says, "I'm just here to present ideas. I'm not a doctor." Well, no shit, sir. We know you're not a doctor. Why are you out here giving millions of people horrible medical advice that could likely kill them?
I mean, I think Don hit it. I mean, he's a huckster and a charlatan. If this was 1880, he would have a little wagon and a couple of donkeys, and he'd have a medicine show. I mean, it's just unbelievable. But the scary thing is, he's not that bright, and he's just one of the shallowest people I've ever seen in politics, even shallower than the Bushes. And he's like, here's the thing that's dangerous to me. He's dangerous for sure. But what's even more dangerous is he can say what he wants on that podium, but he's not making the decisions around him. The decisions are being made in that White House by people like Steve Miller, who is a rabid racist white nationalist, and the neoconservative elite who are transforming this entire country because they have Trump, because they have their man there and they can do as they will, from closing the post office to privatizing parts of the public sector. Everything they want to do, everything they're pushing, packing the courts with right-wing judges. That's the danger. He's a fool. He's a buffoon, and they're using him to get what they want. That's the real danger we're watching.
Exactly.
Sahar, and in previous points during this coronavirus pandemic, Donald Trump has stood at the White House podium and pushed a drug called hydroxychloroquine. And some of his followers took a similar but not quite version of that. The version that two people in particular took was something used to clean aquariums. It killed one man. It put another person in intensive care. Now, if he was a actual doctor or an attorney, there are actual sanctions for misleading or misrepresenting facts and going against, professional standard of ethics. But these standards don't apply for the president of the United States, and he's really free to spew this nonsense unfettered.
Yeah, what concerns me the most is that there are actually still people out there that believe him. And those are the people I'm most worried about. I think many of us have long ago, at least I have, just stopped listening to him because it was a complete waste of time. It was very clear that he was a demagogue and that he was simply engaged in what I call distraction politics, right? Distract the population from one, your own incompetency, and two, more importantly, from these very dangerous long-term policies that were just mentioned in terms of changing who was going to be in the courts, immigration policies, all sort of welfare policies, et cetera. And so part of the strategy is to distract the public with all of these hysterical and circus-like performances that he's had over the last 3 years. So we know that happens, and we can anticipate it getting much worse actually in the next 6 months because he's very desperate. He's going to look for anything and anyone he can blame for the failing economy, including immigrants, which we just saw with this latest completely ineffective ban on immigrants that come through family-sponsored immigration. And the numbers are minuscule. We're talking about at most 110,000 people for the entire year. And that's nothing compared to the labor market, and half those people are children anyway. So it has nothing to do with the economy, it has nothing to do with jobs, it has everything to do with him trying to feed red meat to his very far-right base. Unfortunately, that same far-right base believes what he says and may very well go and start swallowing bleach. And they are going, so now they have to feel, they're under threat from the virus itself and then from these dangerous statements to their health that he's making. And the question for us is this country going to remove him from office in November? And if it doesn't, I think we need to do some major introspection about who we are as a country to allow this individual, who clearly is a threat to our public health and to many other aspects of our life, and we still let him occupy the White House.
Gang, we have a comment from YouTube. Mr. A says, Donald Trump is the epitome of white privilege. I don't think we have any disagreement there. But Sahar, you expressed concern for the safety of Trump supporters, given this bad advice that their Lord and Savior has presented onto them. And the good folks at Lysol were also concerned. They posted a statement on their website. Let's get a look at that, Dwayne. Because Lysol said, listen, due to the recent speculation and social media activity, RB, the makers of Lysol and Dettol, have been asked whether internal administration of disinfectants may be appropriate for investigation or use as a treatment against coronavirus. And the answer is hell no, is their response in short. I mean, the fact that Lysol felt compelled, I'm sure from even like a corporate legal responsibility perspective, to put this disclaimer out there, like, no, people, this is a very bad idea. And it says a lot to me about Americans, that Americans need to be told not to consume disinfectants. What are y'all thoughts?
Oh my God.
Yeah.
I mean,
I tell you.
I don't even, I mean, you can't,
Go ahead, Marc.
to take this, look, he is dangerous on all fronts. And this is funny, but it's not funny. I mean, there are people going to go out there and try this. There are people going to listen to him because they believe him. I'm in touch with there are people I know in my life who really like Donald Trump. They believe everything he says. He's a demigod to them. And some of them will try this and think it's going to cure them or prevent them from getting the disease itself. And it's a real danger. I mean, when you have almost half of this country supporting Donald Trump, we are in the midst of a major political battle. He's a buffoon. We can laugh at him, but what's happening around him and what he does is absolutely serious. I mean, it's unbelievable.
Yeah. He, as you said, to many of his supporters, he's a demigod. but really he's a demagogue, as
Yes, right.
Sahar pointed out. That's
Very
essentially
well put.
what he is.
Right.
I am also very concerned about the enablers that he has, particularly in the leadership of the Republican Party, which is, has is a white people's party. It's a white supremacist party, and you have people like Mitch McConnell, who was leading the majority in the Senate, the Republicans in the Senate, who turned a deaf ear to this nonsense and continues to uphold him and support him and enable him. And this, of course, is a party of big capital. It has always been that. But it is now showing how low it can go in terms of supporting the absurd ideas of a white supremacist who happens to be sitting in the White House. It's a scary, to me anyway, it's a very scary proposition. I would not underestimate the possibility that come November, if things are really bad in the economy and the coronavirus is resurging again in the fall, that Trump may try to pull off a coup d'etat. He may try to either postpone the elections or claim that he has executive authority to implement some kind of draconian measure. I would not be surprised if he's planning to do that.
Well, speaking of draconian measures, Sahar, you touched on this just a moment ago, but the new news from the Trump White House regarding immigration policy, where he has issued via executive order a ban on green card issuance for green card holders and for their families. Can you tell us a bit about this, please?
Yes, and I just have an op-ed that just went up on Al Arabi English, or if people want to read more about the details. But effectively, what he did was really fascinating, and this has also been part of his strategy. Is first he sends out a completely outlandish tweet, such as, "I'm going to ban all immigrants from the United States." To see what the response is, to see where the limits are. It's similar to toddler behavior. How far can I go before my parents, before I get in trouble? And immediately you had many politicians, particularly in the Democratic Party, but I think even in the Republican Party, saying, wait a minute, if you ban all immigrants, who's going to go and work in the farms to make sure that we can eat during this pandemic? Who's going to work in the poultry and meat factories and many of the jobs that many native-born Americans don't want to take? And these are essential jobs during a pandemic. So then he backtracks and eventually limits it to something that's quite narrow, but has absolutely nothing to do with keeping us healthy during the pandemic, and nothing to do, or will have no effect on the skyrocketing unemployment, which is now between 15 to 20%. And the Great Depression, just to give you context, was about 25%. So these are the highest numbers we've seen in more than 100 years, or nearly 100 years. But essentially what it does is it prohibits the State Department and the DHS from issuing any immigrant visas to siblings and parents of U.S. citizens and green card holders who are essentially applying for their siblings and parents to come to the United States. And that's the foundation of our immigration system since 1965, which is a family-based, family sponsorship-based, meaning that most of the immigrant visas we issue every year go to siblings, parents, children, spouses of U.S. citizens or current green card holders. Now, he did exempt spouses and children, but he included and is targeting the parents and the siblings. And how many are we talking about here? We're talking about, as I said before, 190,000 people a year. That's nothing. That's a fraction. We're a country of 328 million, and that includes everyone, not just those who are in the labor market. So by prohibiting them from coming in for 60 days, which we should all anticipate is going to be extended, and it will probably be extended all the way until the elections. What he's doing will do nothing to help unemployment, but it will do everything to be able to tell this far right xenophobic voter base, that look, I'm acting on my promise to make America great again. And those are dog whistle. It's a dog whistle slogan that really means make America white again. And part of doing that is keeping out as many non-European immigrants from coming to the United States and deporting as many non-white immigrants from the US. And that's part of the Muslim ban. And that's part of his attempts to, in violation of the Constitution, to try to prohibit people from being able to get citizenship by being born in the US. And all of this anchor baby, racist rhetoric, which is clearly targeting immigrants and specifically Latinos, part of his border wall, part of his refusal to give asylum to people fleeing from war and conflict in Latin America, which our country actively contributed to the creation of that political instability over the last 20 or 30 years. So unfortunately, we're going to see more of the same. So the good news is it is a small number of people, but the bad news is that it's the beginning. He's just putting a little hook in, and then he's going to try to expand that. And he's going to continue to do this and also be ready for a lot more Islamophobia, right? He just tried to do that recently by claiming that Muslims were COVID-19 spreaders because they were allegedly not closing their mosques and allegedly praying, when in fact they were not. And the people who were keeping their churches open and who were gathering hundreds of people, notwithstanding the skyrocketing infection rate, were these evangelical far-right Christians in Florida and in the South and in what we call the Bible Belt. Of course, not all the Christian groups were doing that, not all evangelicals, but this is the irony, right? Members of his own base were engaging in very dangerous activity in terms of not following the stay-at-home orders, and yet he blames the Muslims. So you're going to see a lot more of that, unfortunately, so we need to brace ourselves.
Dawn, I feel that in the midst of this rise of authoritarianism in the United States, that sometimes we can suffer from a lack of imagination. And, we hate to think about depravity and straight up cruelty and inhumanity to people who are coming here seeking better opportunities for themselves and for their families. But I fear that the situation could further deteriorate for immigrants and people who are seeking refuge and asylum here in the U.S. I mean, we do have actual concentration camps with the ICE detention camps where children are being held by the thousands. The COVID virus is spreading in those facilities as well. Can we even conceive of a worst case scenario for immigrants specifically, if we are to get possibly a second term of Donald Trump?
No, unfortunately not. I think that this madness is going to continue from the White House with Trump as the main spokesman. This is also a way of testing, you might say, a policy. And I believe the Washington Post came out with a story today saying that they were able to get a hold of a taped conversation with what's his name, who is his main immigration man in the administration, saying that this is actually a test run. If we can get away with this, then we can implement more stricter regimen against immigrants coming into the country in whatever shape or form they come in. It is the most inhumane, cruel policy that any modern administration in the U.S. has implemented. And unfortunately, this is going to continue because we have in the White House not only a buffoon, not only a madman, not only someone who is dangerous, but someone who has no empathy whatsoever. He doesn't have a humanitarian bone in his body, and it's all about him. It's all about his agenda. It's all about satisfying his narcissistic pathologies. It's a very sad situation, unfortunately.
Marc,
what you were thinking about was, I was going to tell you what the person we're talking about just now is Stephen Miller.
Stephen
The
Miller,
person
exactly.
who I alluded to earlier, who is
Right.
a fervent white nationalist who tried to say the demonstrators across America were the new Rosa Parks. And that's who made the statement. And he is singularly one of the most dangerous people inside the White House. He's got Trump's ear. He's pushing that white nationalist agenda very hard, and it's being heard and listened to. So yeah, that's who you were talking about, Stephen Miller.
Yeah, Stephen Miller, that's right.
You know, Marc, Don talks about Trump having just a lack of empathy, and obviously one large portion of government workers that he has completely no empathy for, it would seem, are U.S. Postal Service workers. They number around 600,000, but there was no accommodations or funding made available in the COVID stimulus package passed by Congress, signed by the president, and it is not even a secret. It's like the worst kept secret that Donald Trump and the GOP want the post office to fail. How closely are they to achieving that end?
He is elected president again, there'll be no post office. Yeah, let's take a step backwards a minute. When this started coming up, I started reading articles earlier today from 2018, where his advisors were talking about that we have to end the post office. We have to give all their national routes to private organizations like Federal Express, Amazon, and other places like that. So they had this plan even from the beginning. They've been talking about this. And we have to remember also what the post office has been historically. I mean, in this country, a huge part of the black middle class that came into being in the 40s and 50s were people who worked in the post office. The post office has one of the highest percentages of combat veterans working for the federal government are in the post office. And they've been trying to privatize this for a long time. And he's going to make that push. Now, if he keeps pushing the post office and taking money away from them, even Biden said this today, which was a shock, was that he could use this as an excuse to postpone the elections because you got COVID-19 and you can't go to the polls. And if the post office can't do its job, we can't get you mail-in ballots. We're going to have to wait. Now, that's maybe sound far-fetched, but not completely far-fetched. And so it's a combination of people losing their jobs, taking a vital part of the public service and privatizing that. And he right now what he's done, he said, unless the post office raises their rates, he's not going to give them any more money. And trying to get the Treasury Department to pick up that part of the postal service's work. So he's doing everything he can to the beating of the neoconservative right that are the people who are actually running the government to do away with the post office as their first big hit. This is not just Trump. It's the people around him. It's the Heritage Foundation. It's the Koch brothers. It's all the people around him who are pushing these agendas, doing it through Trump because he knows nobody's doing. And they go to him and go, Donald, we should end the post office. We can do that this year if we do this. And he'll go, that's a good idea. Let's do that. And, that's exactly what's happening.
Part of the reason why the post office finds itself in financial trouble, so to speak, is because during the administration of George W. Bush, he mandated that the post office had to fund its pensions 75 years in advance, which put it in an immediate deficit. But Sahar, when we're talking about Donald Trump and his minions, we are talking about a bunch of corporate bloodsuckers who the concept of something for the public service or for the public good never even enters the equation as far as they're concerned. So the post office is something that was never meant to be profitable. But as Marc says, this is an opportunity to seize power by making sure that mail-in voting, really the only option available for us if this pandemic continues going into November, that's the only option on the table for most people to vote come this fall.
Yeah, I think that so whenever we have a national emergency, we learned a lot from 9/11. At least that's the other national emergency that I was alive for, and others may have experienced other national emergencies, but they can be very dangerous on many fronts. So not only are they dangerous in terms of the immediate emergency at issue in 9/11, it was the fear that there would be more major terrorist attacks in the United States. And now it is this very palpable and reasonable fear of a pandemic that thus far has killed 49,000, almost 50,000 people in the United States in only the last 6 or 7 weeks, and almost 1 million people are infected. So there is a reason to, there is in fact a national emergency. But what happens legally and politically is that those in power use it as an opportunity to get through policies they otherwise couldn't during normal times. And so this post office example is one of those, right? The immigration bans is another one. So we also need to be thinking about all of the things that we should be anticipating in the next 6 months, because I have no doubt that Trump's advisors, particularly those who are white nationalists, particularly those who are anti-government and pro-privatization, those who are anti-poor, those who are anti any type of public welfare services, anti-public education, they're all going to be thinking about how can we use the next 6 months and possibly more if they stay in office, but during this national emergency for pandemic, how can we change the laws and how can we use our executive authority to implement many of these policies? That's why he was so upset when Congress wouldn't vote on his nominees for the judiciary, right? Because that's part of his agenda, as someone else just mentioned. So that, on the one hand, we need to be awake and we need to pay attention and we need to anticipate, those of us who are on the progressive side of politics, and be prepared for it rather than be reactionary and reactive, because it is coming. It happened during 9/11. Much of what was in the Patriot Act, for example, which was passed within 45 days, it was a gigantic law, but because it was a national emergency, everybody was hysterical. The public wanted action. Congress passed it, but a large chunk of it was legislation that people, particularly on the political right, had been trying to push for more than a decade, but they couldn't because they were laws that would violate civil liberties in particular. And now we're seeing the same thing. So the other aspect of this that we really need to pay attention to, and others have mentioned this, and I'm glad that Biden's brought it up publicly with his stature, is that Trump is an authoritarian. We know he's an authoritarian. The evidence is very clear. By temperament, he's an authoritarian, and politically and ideologically, he has an authoritarian vision of executive leadership. The only thing that's kept him from being an authoritarian to the extreme, or more meaningfully, like bona fide authoritarian regimes abroad, are institutions, right? Whether it's the judiciary, whether it's Congress, whether it's mass mobilization, exercising First Amendment rights. And during national emergencies, those types of checks and those types of institutions tend to either be eroded because people are afraid, or everything has been disrupted, or because he invokes executive authority to be able to supersede those checks. So I do not think it's far-fetched at all that he is in fact right now thinking of a plan B. In other words, plan A is win the election. But with an economy that is tanking, the most natural person to blame, which in this situation I think is appropriate, is going to be the president. Just like if the economy is good, incumbents tend to win elections, notwithstanding whatever shortcomings they have. So he's thinking of a plan B, and that is postponing the elections. So I wouldn't be surprised if that has gone into their thought calculus, even though, of course, they wanted to get rid of the post office for a while. So we need to be thinking about, okay, what are the things he's going to be planning to perpetuate his far-right, anti-people policies, and also to preserve or perpetuate his authoritarian agenda.
Well, gang, go ahead, Don. Go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead. I just wanted to make a comment about the public service, the postal service. Postal service is a public asset. You know, it is not a private company driven by the profit motive. It is, as Marc pointed out, has been historically an opening to the middle class for so many African American working people. I recall our good friend Danny Glover always lifting up the U.S. Postal Service as the place where his parents, both his mother and his father, worked for the U.S. Postal Service in the San Francisco area for many, many years, and enabled them to live a modest middle class existence. And the majority of postal workers around the country are, in fact, people of color. So this push to privatize the postal service is motivated by this, almost pathological obedience to the need to privatize every aspect of our society's life, and it is part and parcel of that whole neoliberal agenda that Trump has bought into, and in fact the Republican Party has become a bulwark against any effort to maintain or to reinforce a public asset like the U.S. Postal Service, particularly if the majority of the workers there are people of color.
Gang, I wanted to bring a story to your attention. I saw it percolating in and around Twitter, and it is not made national news. And there's a lot of questions as to why this is not a national news story. So, at one of those reopen the country rallies, this one was held in Huntington Beach, California. A 36-year-old man, let me tell you where I'm quoting from. This is from the Sacramento Bee reporting. I like to always credit the journalists, and I just lost their names. I'll find it again. Well, anyway, a 36-year-old protester who was participating in these demonstrations was being recorded, as all the demonstrators were, by a local news crew from KTTV. And Christian Francis Peterson of Costa Mesa, he's been arrested. He's been jailed on suspicion of exhibiting a deadly weapon other than a firearm and kidnapping. So what's to alleged have happened is that Christian Peterson saw this news crew filming the demonstrations. He pulled out a knife. He allegedly forced the news crew into their van, held them at knife point, and forced them to delete any footage in which he happened to be captured. Now, this is terrifying because this is a flat out attack on the press, on members of the media who are out covering what is a legitimate news story. But if these allegations are true, clearly this man felt emboldened by the words of the president, repeatedly calling the media fake news, repeatedly, undermining the news in such a way that journalists have been threatened and now, as we see, actually attacked. Marc Steiner, I wanted to get your take on this because I can only imagine, number one, the reluctance or maybe the fear that some of these members of this news crew may have had being out there covering this in the first place. But then one of these nuts to come up and allegedly pull a knife, kidnap them, hold them hostage, and force them to delete their tapes. What are your thoughts?
My first thought there's so much here. I mean, I'm sure the story will get picked up. It should be picked up by the country to see what's going on. One of the grave dangers here is that a huge portion of Trump supporters are armed and prepared to fight, and we have to be realistic about that and know that's real. This is not a joke. What this man did is the tip of the iceberg. And I do think he was pushed on probably by Trump's rhetoric. Fake news, they're taking my picture. They shouldn't be able to take my picture. I'm going to stop them. What can they do to me? And I think that you can see, as this intensifies, the violence that comes out of the demonstrators that can turn into mobs, we can see that developing. And we have to be really wary of that. And we also have to be ready to react to it. And I think it's a very dangerous sign. Like Trump, in that piece we showed earlier, at his press conference, where he was yelling at the reporter, "You're not a real reporter, you're fake news." I mean, he was going after the person who was trying to ask a legitimate question that you asked the president of the United States. And that really gets people worked up. I mean, I see now that, the people I know who support Trump, they start saying people are Democrats. They are talking about that we have to keep our guns loaded and ready. So this is holding that group by knife. clearly was pushed on by the fake news issue, but it's also emblematic of something much deeper and much more dangerous in terms of the coming political struggle that could take place in this country. I think we have to remember one thing, and I'll stop here, is that this country really is in many ways a very reactionary nation. It's always been reactionary against immigrants. We're a country that was built on the enslavement of Africans and taking away the land of indigenous people and practicing genocide on them. So, and those communities already understand what it means to live in an oppressive world inside of our country. And we cannot be naive enough to think that it couldn't happen here to all of us. And it could. And we can see ourselves sliding into this authoritarianism. People call it fascist. You know, as Noam Chomsky said in my interview with him the other day, I don't call it fascism because that is a particular ideology, but it is authoritarianism, and it is anti-democratic, and it is very real. And that knife was the pinpoint in our face.
You know, Don, I'm sure you, as have I, as have many of us, have reported on conservative events. You know, I've attended CPAC for a couple of years. I went to the Republican National Convention in 2012. I did survive, yes. But I'll say, you know, I've been to a bunch of stuff, you know, a bunch of like right to life rallies on the mall. I mean, I don't shrink away from going to witness, you know, conservatives in the wild, so to speak. But I will say, I've never felt unsafe. And it's not that I felt that these people weren't, you know, squirrely, but they never made me feel unsafe. But at the same time, as Marc said, you know, if they're Trump supporters or, you know, conservative leaning, chances are they got the toolie or some resemblance of some sort of weaponry on them. And if they so felt to, you know, motivated to intimidate somebody, they certainly could do so. What advice would you have to journalists who are out covering these specific events of this specific demographic who have now been fired up in the direction of being hostile, openly hostile towards the media?
Yeah. Well, my only advice really is to be careful, you know, and be aware that there are these deranged individuals, like the man with the knife, who have been riled up by Trump even before he became president, during his campaign rallies, and after that, whenever he went out on the stump, you know, he would always, in fact, point to the press corps standing in the back of the room and saying that they are the fake news, they are the enemy of the people. He actually described the media as the enemy of the people. And there are, unfortunately, millions of folks who consider Trump a demigod, who would actually believe the words that comes out of his mouth. And I'm surprised, I'm pleasantly surprised, actually, that there have not been more incidents of violent aggression against the media in the country, in the U.S. as a whole. I mean, he was just the way he confronts the members of, you know, the fourth estate, as we in the media were once described as, you know, the fourth pillar of American democracy. The way he addresses the journalists who are in the press room, asking legitimate questions, is just it's abhorrent, you know, and yet he can get away with it, unfortunately. So I would say, Kim, you know, to my fellow journalists, just you know, be very careful. Be very careful when you go out there to cover these kinds of events. And another thing that to Marc's point earlier, they are heavily armed and well-trained white supremacist militias all over the country who, as they say, are loaded for bear, you know, and will not hesitate to use the weaponry and the training that they have. Unfortunately, many of them come out of the military, and so they are, you know, trained soldiers, and now they have the right, so to speak, to be able to go to political rallies armed to the teeth. I've never seen anything like this in this country or anywhere else, as a matter of fact.
Sahar, the United States is not usually one of those nations that experience journalists being killed, and these journalists who went through this ordeal in California with this particular protester allegedly, they were fortunate to walk away with their lives. And given the fact that the tenor towards the press is so hostile, have we now had a genuine shift in really maintaining the legitimacy of the media and ensuring their safety as well?
Well, I think we need to kind of look broad and then narrow down to this issue. So what we've seen since the presidential campaigning in 2015 onward, so now we're into the 5th year, is this normalization of hypermasculinity, of authoritarian temperament, of condoning violence or anything that gets very, very close to engaging in physical violence, but certainly condoning dignitary violence and mental violence. We've seen hate crimes go up against many communities, particularly Muslim communities, during the presidential elections. And so what we've seen now is you've got 5 years of Americans being exposed on a regular basis to this type of behavior that otherwise is considered unacceptable, particularly for someone who is at the highest office. And that is normalizing behavior that over the long run, and if it expands into society, is divisive and invidious and eventually leads to violence. I mean, this country has always been vulnerable to civil war. In fact, so I'm an immigrant and I come from Egypt, where it's relatively homogeneous particularly compared to the United States. And one of the things that's remarkable to me about the United States is the fact that it is so diverse, yet it is not nearly as balkanized as it could be. But when you think of Yugoslavia and the war that happened there, when you think of all these other wars where it is because there is so much variety or differences in ethnic groups. And so we're always in this fragile situation where pluralism is extremely important to keep our stability and keep us thriving because we are an immigrant nation. So what he's done is he's normalized this very dangerous rhetoric and activity. And what you're seeing now is just one example of that. And usually when journalists start to become threatened and it becomes more than just an anomaly or something that is rare, is usually that's a sign of two things. So one is, yes, the delegitimization of the media and being perceived as an entity that, rather than being for the common good, is actually a threat. And second is it usually is a sign of the elimination of law and order. Because most people are not going to attack if they think that they will be prosecuted, if they think that they don't have immunity. So part of what Trump does in his normalization of these types of domestic threats is that he signals to them that you can go ahead and do this, and I'm essentially giving you the thumbs up. Now, what's important is, are the local police and the federal law enforcement, are they prosecuting these individuals? Are they indicting them and essentially holding them accountable to criminal law? Because that can counter that, but that's after the fact, right? It's too little, too late. And there's just one final thing I want to add as a professor, as a law professor. One of the disappointments, or I shouldn't say disappointments, but one of the concerns we all should have is the demise of public education, both K through 12 and higher education. First, only 30% of our country has a college degree. That is not a very high percentage for one of the wealthiest countries in the world. So we really need to increase and expand access to college, because the more educated our population is, the more access they have to skills that are, the more that they're taught critical thinking skills and the ability to engage in independent inquiry and the ability to be able to tell propaganda from fact reporting, accurate factual reporting, the less prone and vulnerable they are to this type of behavior that's coming out of the White House, and less prone they are to the demagoguery and the cult-like. I have a friend who calls Trump and his followers the death cult, because they're cultish in their undying loyalty and they do things that are detrimental to their own health, as we're seeing with the virus, but also detrimental or deadly or lethal for the country. So we need to be connecting that ability for people to see something like this and say, no, this is unacceptable, this is un-American, and it's false. And that also comes with education. So I just want to put a plug in for that we really need to invest more in our public education system.
Kim, can I just one quick thing that to remember that just 60 years ago, when I was in the civil rights movement as a kid, journalists were beaten and killed in the South. This is nothing new. This is just yesterday. And the same people who fomented the violence, they're not deranged because mobs are mobs. These are people who kiss their children goodnight and enjoy their work and love their family and then go out and commit violence against others. And you have to remember that those, and this, I'm not painting a broad brush here because there are a lot of conservatives, I know lots of conservatives who are dear friends of mine and in my family. But this is not a conservative left, right, liberal issue, left conservative issue. This is something built deeper because let's think of our history. The Dixiecrats, the Klan, the people who attacked us in civil rights. You know, when I was civil rights working with, I remember one of the farmers who drove us around. He had a 45 and a shotgun under his seat as he drove us to what we had to do when we were organizing and working in civil rights. And he said to me, "You all are nonviolent, but if any of them crackers come this way, they got to answer to me." That was his response. And I tell that story because those mobs are now part of the legitimate right. And we have to remember what we're facing. I don't mean to be sensationalist about this. I'm being absolutely pragmatic and realistic about what we could face. And that it was just 60 years ago that we were killing mostly black, going after black, mostly black, but also white journalists in the South who were covering the civil rights movement. So I think we have to keep that in perspective.
That is 100% correct, Marc. I appreciate you bringing that point to the conversation. Gang, I wanted to move along because, you know, when we talk about what this country is dealing with, we are in unprecedented times. The people who are having to go to work every day, the essential workers, not just the medical folks, but the people who are working mostly hourly wage jobs, the delivery drivers, the grocery store clerks, the people who work in warehouses, the people who are working in food processing plants. These are among some of the most vulnerable and most unprotected during this crisis. And this could actually pose enormous challenges to our food supply. And we're starting to see some of the cracks of that happening now as a number of food processing plants across the country have had to close because so many workers have been sick. And according to USA Today, what they reported was more than 150 of America's largest meat processing plants operate in counties where the rate of the coronavirus infection is already among the nation's highest. Okay, so this problem is not getting better. In fact, it's getting worse. And there are a number of strikes planned for May Day. I know Target workers plan on striking, as do Amazon workers, and a number of other folks, Instacart included. So, gang, I wanted to ask, you know, what exactly can be done to ensure the food security of us all, but the immediate day-to-day health of our frontline essential workers who are not receiving hazard pay, not receiving the proper protective gear that they need in order to continue to do their jobs, but remain safe at the same time. Don, let's start with you.
Yeah, and it's important to note here, Kim, that the vast majority of the essential workers, those people who are putting their safety on the line every day to provide services for the general public, most of them are people of color. In the meatpacking industry, for example, in the Midwest and South Dakota and places like that, the majority of the workers in the meatpacking industry are Latino workers. So these are workers of color who are, in fact, putting their lives on the line because they are contracting COVID-19 in disproportionate numbers to the rest of the population. And, let us reflect again on the word essential. Without their work, without them going out every day on the front lines in very dangerous conditions, we, the rest of us, will not will not be able to live in a relatively secure condition. I mean, they're talking now about the meat industry is going to be severely impacted, particularly the pork industry, for the next several weeks or even possibly several months. While those essential workers are braving these dangers that they confront every day, they deserve our full support and solidarity. There's no question about that in my mind.
Gang, we're seeing a lot of pictures come across from farmers, produce makers, saying that they are having to dump millions of gallons of milk. There was a picture floating around Twitter this morning of piles of potatoes in Idaho where farmers have just thrown these potatoes out because there's no market for them at present, with school cafeterias and restaurants being closed. How big of a failure of government is this to just not coordinate these resources that are being wasted? As we're seeing lines for people for food pantries, we're seeing food pantries run dry. People are lining up in their cars for miles to get free food, and there's no synergy amongst these problems, which are looking at each other in the mirror somewhat as solutions. Marc Steiner, why aren't we seeing more coordination in the dumping of produce and the feeding of hungry people?
Well, we can start at the top. Let's see who's controlling our government right now. That's one answer to that question. We could be doing more. I mean, if you look at, let's take, for example, you look at many Northern European countries at this moment. The government is paying 70 to 90% of people's salaries, while the companies are paying the rest. Their healthcare is taken care of. So they mobilize entire nations to stem the tide of the virus. By the way, as a sidebar, almost all those places that where they have been able to push COVID back and really launch a national campaign are run by women. Just throw that thought out. But that if you that's
naturally,
true.
Duh.
I'm not arguing. I'm just saying. So the other part of that is, this government does have the capability of doing something. It could mobilize the armed forces to pick up food and deliver it around the country. It could invoke the acts that it has at its power to make sure that we have enough protective gear for everybody in this country and enough tests for everybody in this country who need it. And so things could happen. This country is not organized. The way our free market system works here, it's so free that nobody controls it except they control themselves and they control us. And so but the government could do it if they wanted to. They have not enacted any of those things. There's no reason for throwing potatoes and milk and throwing food away when people are lining up by the thousands at food banks to get food. So yes, we could be doing something very different. The laws are on the books to do it. They have not invoked the laws to make that happen. So there's no reason for this to be going on at all.
Sahar,
just real quick. The people who run the food pantries and around the country are ringing the alarm bells because they themselves are running out of food. The demand is so huge that they are not sure if they could continue to meet that demand in the weeks ahead. And some of them are even complaining about donor fatigue. They go to the philanthropic community, they go to the general public, and they ask for support to buy the food that they're going to distribute to the tens of thousands of people who are hungry. And they themselves are running out of food. So this is a very, very serious situation.
Sahar, it's not a shock that the countries that are doing this best allocating resources are countries run by women. Thank you, Marc, for that nugget of of feminist reinforcement. We do appreciate that, but at the same time, we are dealing with major problems here in the U.S. 25 million people plus have filed for unemployment. We're dealing with food shortages, but at the same time, we have a glut of food that is going to remain uneaten. So how can we, absent the government even, how can we, I guess, mutual aid and crowdsource to fix these particular issues? Because apparently it's going to have to come from the people and not elected officials.
Well, the problem is that the reason why you need government to deal with things that are on such a mass scale, because you have to have the infrastructure, you have to have the ability to be able to very quickly transform or transition to the sudden emergency. So, for example, this is a failure of the market, because based on the free market, businesses are going to do what makes them profit, right? And if it's profitable, they'll do it. One of the challenges with many of these farms and other food suppliers is that the way that they've structured their business is that they deliver and they produce and they package large quantities primarily for school districts, for restaurant chains, so they don't have the ability to very quickly change and transition to provide or package or provide quantities that are more for private individual consumptions or family consumption. Because I've read a lot about how it's really not that simple for them, and that's why they're having a hard time transitioning so quickly, even though there's a supply and there's a very high demand. And I think this is one opportunity for government to intervene and to, for example, subsidize that quick transition so that they can say, okay, well, we're used to creating packages for 50 pounds or 100 pounds of potatoes. Clearly, we can't deliver that to a supermarket, so we need to quickly adapt to being able to put them into packages that can be delivered to food banks, for example, who are willing to purchase the food. But you have to have an infrastructure, you have to have the money, and you have to have the institution to do that on a large scale. And I think that is where government can come in, and whether they're going to pay a private company to help them or whether they're going to do it themselves through some institution, this is exactly why we need government. When we have these emergencies, when we have something that has to happen on a mass scale that's for the public good and not simply for maximizing profit. So I think that this is a case for why small government is a bad idea. I wanted to answer your question about the employees. So there's something called the Defense Production Act of 1950, which Trump very begrudgingly and delayingly finally invoked, and particularly for ventilators, where he then ordered 3M and other companies to produce N95 masks and to produce ventilators. And he also ordered them to distribute those to hospitals and healthcare providers as opposed to allow them to sell it on the free market to whoever can purchase it. And he can do the same thing when it comes to food or anything where essentially his national emergency powers allows him to instruct private companies on what to produce and who to sell them to. And it's not that these companies have to give the products away for free. They still earn money and they still are able to survive economically. But this is a way for the government to direct production, both in terms of what is produced and who gets to purchase those products based on the public good, the common good. And capitalism is based on the individual good and the individual interest and the individual profit, right, of a particular company or particular individuals. And this pandemic is a collective problem. We are all in it together. And this is just an example of how this very extreme capitalism just isn't working. And these pandemics could come back again. So all that is to say that I think there's a lot that can be done, but the current administration does not want to do it. And they don't want to do it for ideological reasons. That's what's so dangerous to all of us, and dangerous not in an ideological abstract sense, but dangerous in a physical danger. People are dying. People are getting sick and they're dying and not having access to healthcare, not having access to food, and not having access to basic goods is going to, we're in crisis mode, and our government clearly doesn't seem to value the life of its people.
No, that this capitalistic nightmare, dystopia that we find ourselves in is completely not sustainable. But I'll tell you what is sustainable, though. The kind of programming and news that we bring you here at the Real News Network. We are in the middle of our fundraising drive, and we need your help. We need you to drop us a couple coins because all of these donations will be matched. But I'll let the host of the Police Accountability Report tell you more.
Hello, my name is Taya Graham, and this is Stephen Janis, and we're the hosts of the Police Accountability Report. We're trying to do a $50,000 fundraiser right now, and each dollar will be matched.
Now more than ever, we need independent journalism that's not funded by corporate backers. We need people that can give us the truth and the unvarnished truth. So we really need you to help and donate.
And please remember, any donation, how small, it will be matched, and trust me, it will be appreciated. Thank you so much for your support, and be safe out there.
Undoubtedly, my favorite show on the Real News, the Police Accountability Report. Thank you so much, Stephen and Taya. Well, gang, you have yet another hour getting stir crazy with the Real News. I'd like to thank our fantastic panel for joining us today. Marc Steiner, Don Rojas, and Sahar Aziz. You guys were brilliant. Thank you so much for coming on, and you are always welcome to join us again.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kim.
Thank you.
You were brilliant as well.
Yes.
Oh, thank you, Don.
Thank you.
Hey, I heard y'all was getting rowdy in the comments, okay? Y'all be easy in there, okay? I'm Kim Brown. We'll hang out again on Monday, gang. Have a fantastic weekend and Ramadan Mubarak for our Muslim sisters and brothers who are celebrating right now. You guys have a great one.
Happy Ramadan.
Be safe.